The emergency call came through at 4:47 a.m. on November 12, 2018. Dubai Marina's most exclusive residential tower, the Celestial Heights, where penthouses sold for $25 million and monthly maintenance fees exceeded most people's annual salaries. The dispatcher's voice remained calm despite the caller's panic. 3 bodies, blood everywhere. A woman screaming in Arabic and English, her words barely coherent through hyperventilation and shock. When Dubai Police's elite homicide investigation unit arrived at the 58th floor penthouse, they found a scene that would challenge even the most experienced investigators. The marble entryway, imported from Carrara, Italy at $10,000 per square meter, was splattered with arterial spray that created modern art against pristine white walls. The living room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Persian Gulf, had been transformed into a battlefield where luxury met violence in the most disturbing possible way. 3 bodies, 3 very different stories, and one woman at the center of it all. Sitting on a velvet sofa that cost more than a luxury car, wrapped in a blood-soaked designer robe, was Isabella Santos. Her dark eyes were vacant, staring at nothing and everything simultaneously. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, but not from the air conditioning that kept the penthouse at a perfect 21 degrees Celsius. She was trembling from the weight of secrets that had finally exploded into violence, destroying everything and everyone in their path. But this story doesn't begin with murder. It begins 18 months earlier, in the cramped servants' quarters behind a different luxury tower, where dreams and desperation created the perfect conditions for tragedy. Dubai in 2017 represented the ultimate paradox of modern civilization. A city where the world's tallest building pierced clouds at 828 meters while, in its shadow, migrant workers lived 8 to a room, sending money home to families they hadn't seen in years. The statistics told a story of extremes: 200 different nationalities, 85% expatriate population, and an economy built on the backs of 3.2 million foreign workers whose labor created the miracles of glass and steel that rose from desert sand. Within this vast ecosystem of dreams and exploitation, the Filipino community numbered over 700,000 souls. They were the nurses who staffed hospitals, the teachers who educated children, the drivers who navigated the impossible traffic, and the domestic workers who maintained the illusion of effortless luxury in homes worth more than their entire neighborhoods back in Manila, Cebu, or Davao. Isabella Santos belonged to this invisible army of workers who made Dubai function. Born on August 3, 1993 in Tondo, Manila, one of the Philippines' most notorious slums, she had grown up understanding that survival required calculation, adaptability, and the willingness to do whatever it took to escape the crushing poverty that killed dreams before they could fully form. Her childhood was measured in missed meals and borrowed school uniforms. Her father, Roberto, had died when she was 7, killed in a robbery gone wrong while working as a security guard for a shopping mall. The compensation his family received barely covered funeral expenses. Her mother, Luz, took in laundry and worked as a domestic helper for wealthy Manila families, coming home each night with hands cracked from detergent and a back bent from scrubbing floors. Isabella was the eldest of 5 children, which meant her childhood ended the moment her father died. At 7 years old, she was already caring for her younger siblings, cooking rice in their single pot, rationing the dried fish that constituted their protein, and learning to stretch every peso until it screamed for mercy. School was a luxury they could barely afford, but Luz insisted her children attend. "Education is the only inheritance I can give you," she would say, her voice fierce despite her exhaustion. Isabella took this lesson to heart, studying by candlelight when the electricity was cut, which was often. She finished high school through sheer determination, graduating with honors despite working part-time at a convenience store to help support her siblings. But college was impossible. The tuition alone would have bankrupted their family 3 times over. So at 18, Isabella made the same choice thousands of Filipino women make every year. She applied to work overseas, where even the hardest jobs paid more than professional work in the Philippines. The recruitment agency promised her employment as a retail assistant in Dubai, with a salary of 3,000 dirhams monthly, approximately $800. It seemed like a fortune compared to the 150 pesos, less than $3, she earned for a 12-hour shift at the convenience store. The recruitment fees were crushing, 180,000 pesos borrowed from a loan shark at 20% monthly interest, but the recruiter assured her she could pay it off within a year. The contract she signed in the recruiter's cramped office bore little resemblance to the employment she would actually receive. But Isabella, desperate and inexperienced, had no way of knowing that the document represented the first of many betrayals she would experience in her pursuit of a better life. She arrived at Dubai International Airport on January 15, 2017, carrying a single battered suitcase and dreams that felt as fragile as soap bubbles. The heat hit her like a physical force the moment she stepped outside, a dry, relentless heat that seemed to suck moisture from her lungs. The city that rose before her seemed impossible, a fevered dream of glass towers and 8-lane highways where cars that cost more than homes in Manila moved in synchronized rivers of expensive metal. The reality of her employment became clear within hours. There was no retail position. Instead, she was placed as a domestic helper in the household of Rashid Al-Mazrui, a mid-level government official whose family compound in Jumeirah housed 3 generations and required a staff of 8 to maintain. Her actual salary was 1,200 dirhams monthly, less than half what was promised. Her accommodation was a small room she shared with 2 other Filipino workers, attached to the servants' quarters with a separate entrance that ensured household staff remained invisible to the family. Her work schedule began at 5:00 a.m. with breakfast preparation and ended after dinner cleanup around 10:00 p.m., 7 days a week. The loan shark's 20% monthly interest meant she owed 216,000 pesos after just 1 month. Her 1,200 dirham salary, after conversion, was approximately 16,000 pesos. After sending money home for her siblings, education, and her mother's medical expenses, she had almost nothing left to pay down the crushing debt that grew faster than she could earn. For 8 months, Isabella worked in the Al-Mazrui household, her youth and beauty slowly fading under the relentless pressure of impossible hours and crushing financial stress. She aged 5 years in those 8 months, her smile becoming mechanical, her eyes losing the light that had once promised that she could overcome anything. It was during this period of desperation that she met Carlos Mendoza. Carlos represented everything Isabella had been taught to want in a partner. At 31, he was 8 years her senior, which in Filipino culture suggested stability and maturity. He worked as a private driver for the Khalid family, one of Dubai's most prominent business dynasties. His salary of 4,500 dirhams monthly, while modest by Dubai standards, seemed like wealth to Isabella. Most importantly, he was kind. They met at the Filipino Catholic Church in Jebel Ali, one of the few places where the city's Filipino community could gather openly, maintaining connections to home through shared language, faith, and the comfort of familiar food sold by vendors outside the church after Sunday Mass. Carlos noticed Isabella during a service in September 2017. She was sitting alone in a back pew, her eyes closed in prayer, tears streaming down her face. He waited until after Mass, then approached her carefully, respectfully, offering a tissue and a gentle inquiry about whether she was okay. Their courtship followed traditional patterns despite their modern circumstances. Carlos would meet Isabella on her rare days off, usually once every 2 weeks when the Al-Mazrui family traveled and gave their staff a brief respite. They would walk along Jumeirah Beach, watching the sunset turn the Persian Gulf into liquid gold, talking about their families back home, their dreams of eventually returning to the Philippines with enough savings to start small businesses. Carlos shared his own story of sacrifice and survival. Born in Mindanao in 1986, he had grown up during the region's long conflict between government forces and separatist groups. His father had been killed in crossfire when Carlos was 15, making him the family's primary breadwinner before he could even finish high school. He had worked as a jeepney driver in Davao for years, saving every peso until he could afford the recruitment fees to work in Dubai. For 3 years, Carlos had been sending money home religiously, supporting his mother and three younger sisters. One sister was now in nursing school because of his sacrifices. Another was finishing teacher's training. The youngest was in high school, the first woman in their family to progress that far in education. "Everything I do," Carlos told Isabella during one of their sunset walks, "is so they never have to struggle the way we did." Isabella understood this in her bones. It was the same motivation that had brought her to Dubai, the same crushing sense of responsibility that made personal happiness seem like a selfish luxury when family survival hung in the balance. Their engagement was practical rather than romantic. After 3 months of careful courtship, Carlos proposed not with a ring he couldn't afford, but with a promise. "Marry me," he said simply. "We'll combine our salaries, pay off your debt faster, and work together toward our future." Isabella accepted, not because of overwhelming passion, but because Carlos represented safety, stability, and a partnership based on shared struggle and mutual respect. In the economics of migrant worker life, this was as close to love as many people could afford. They were married in a simple civil ceremony at the Philippine consulate on December 20th, 2017. The entire ceremony cost 400 dirhams, including the documentation fees. Isabella wore a white dress borrowed from a friend. Carlos wore his best shirt, carefully pressed the night before. They exchanged simple silver bands that cost 50 dirhams each from a shop in Dera. After the ceremony, they celebrated with a small group of Filipino friends at a budget restaurant that served pancit and lumpia. The total bill was 600 dirhams, split among the guests. It was the happiest day Isabella had experienced since arriving in Dubai, surrounded by people who understood her journey, married to a good man who promised to walk beside her through whatever challenges lay ahead. She had no way of knowing that happiness would last exactly 7 weeks. Carlos's employment with the Khalid family came with one significant benefit. As a married man, his visa sponsorship entitled him to a dependent visa for his wife, which would allow Isabella to change employers more easily and potentially find work with better conditions. The process required several documents, fees, and the involvement of Carlos's sponsor. This bureaucratic necessity brought Isabella into the orbit of the man who would destroy everything. Tariq bin Khalid Al-Nahyan was born into power the way most people are born into families. His grandfather had been among the founding sheiks who established the United Arab Emirates in 1971, transforming tribal territories into one of the world's wealthiest nations. His father had expanded the family fortune through strategic investments in oil, real estate, and finance, building an empire estimated at $4.8 billion. Tariq himself, at 46, represented the third generation of UAE royalty. Educated at Oxford and Harvard, he held degrees in economics and international relations that he had never needed to use. His position as CEO of Khalid Enterprises was hereditary rather than earned, but to his credit, he had proven surprisingly competent. Under his leadership, the company had diversified into technology, renewable energy, and luxury hospitality. His penthouse in Celestial Heights was one of 3 properties he owned in Dubai alone. The others included a beach villa in Palm Jumeirah and a desert estate that hosted falcon hunting parties for visiting dignitaries. He also maintained residences in London, New York, and Monaco, spending roughly equal time in each location, moving through the world with the effortless grace of someone who had never encountered a closed door. Physically, Tariq was handsome in the way that wealth makes men handsome. He was tall, over 6 feet, with the lean build maintained through personal trainers and private gym facilities. His features were sharp and aristocratic, his beard perfectly groomed, his kandjura, the traditional white robe, always immaculate and clearly expensive in ways that only other wealthy people could recognize. But beneath the polished exterior lived a man rotting from the inside. His marriage to Sheikha Fatima, arranged when he was 25, had produced 3 children who were now teenagers being educated in Switzerland. The marriage was a formality maintained for social and political reasons. Fatima lived primarily in Abu Dhabi, managing her own business interests and philanthropic foundations, seeing her husband perhaps 6 times annually for obligatory family gatherings. Tariq's real life existed in the spaces between his obligations. His appetites were legendary among certain circles in Dubai, whispered about at private clubs and exclusive gatherings. He collected women the way some men collected cars, for the thrill of acquisition and the pleasure of possession. His targets followed a pattern: beautiful, vulnerable, usually foreign women whose legal status in the UAE made them dependent and easily controlled. The house staff knew. Carlos had been driving Tariq for 2 years and had witnessed the rotation of special assistants and personal consultants who would appear suddenly, be given apartments and allowances, then disappear just as quickly. He had driven Tariq to assignations at luxury hotels, waited hours in parking garages while his employer conducted affairs that everyone acknowledged but no one mentioned. Carlos understood that maintaining ignorance was part of his job description. Drivers saw everything and said nothing. This unspoken rule was the price of employment, and Carlos, focused on supporting his family and building a life with his new wife, followed it carefully. He never imagined his employer would notice Isabella. The visa paperwork required Isabella to visit Khalid Enterprises' headquarters for an interview with the HR department. It was a formality, but a necessary one. Carlos had requested permission from the Al-Mazrui family to bring his wife for this appointment, and they had grudgingly agreed to let her leave for one afternoon. She arrived at the headquarters tower on February 5, 2018, wearing her best dress, a simple blue cotton garment that she had carefully ironed the night before. The building itself was intimidating, all glass and steel and polished marble, with security personnel who checked her documentation 3 times before allowing her into the air-conditioned lobby. Carlos met her in the reception area, his relief visible. He had been anxious about this meeting, worried that something might go wrong with the paperwork, that some administrative error might derail their plans for Isabella to find better employment. He walked her to the HR department on the 12th floor, waiting nervously in the hallway while she met with Mrs. Sharma, the HR director. The interview was brief and professional. Mrs. Sharma reviewed Isabella's documents, asked standard questions about her employment history and plans in Dubai, then explained the visa process timeline. "Everything appears in order," Mrs. Sharma said with a warm smile. "The dependent visa should be approved within 2 weeks. Once that's done, your husband can help you find more suitable employment." Isabella's relief was profound. For the first time since arriving in Dubai, she felt like circumstances might actually improve. She thanked Mrs. Sharma repeatedly, her gratitude genuine and effusive. As she exited the HR office, still smiling from the good news, she nearly collided with a man emerging from the executive suite. "I'm so sorry," Isabella said quickly, stepping back. Tariq bin Khalid Al-Nahyan stopped, his attention caught by the unfamiliar face. His drivers and domestic staff were fixtures, barely noticed despite daily interaction. But this young woman was new, and her beauty was the kind that made men pause even when they shouldn't. "No harm done," Tariq said in perfect English, his voice smooth and cultured. "Are you here for an interview?" "My wife," Carlos interjected quickly, appearing at Isabella's side. "She was meeting with HR for her dependent visa, sir." Tariq's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your wife?" His gaze moved between Carlos and Isabella, cataloging the significant age and attractiveness differential. "Congratulations on your marriage, Carlos. I wasn't aware." "Thank you, sir," Carlos said, his hand finding Isabella's, a small gesture of protection. "Mrs. Sharma took good care of you?" Tariq directed this to Isabella, his attention making her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't immediately articulate. "Yes, sir, everyone has been very kind," Isabella replied, her eyes downcast respectfully. The interaction lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was enough. Tariq noted the way Isabella held herself with quiet dignity despite her humble clothes. He observed her beauty, which was natural and unenhanced, rare in a city where women's appearances were often aggressively curated. Most significantly, he recognized her vulnerability, the dependency written in her body, language, and circumstances. Over the following weeks, Tariq made inquiries. Discreet questions to his HR director revealed Isabella's background, her debt, her difficult employment with the Al-Mazrui family, her recent marriage to his driver. Further investigation uncovered details about her family in Manila, the loan shark debt accumulating at predatory interest rates, her mother's medical issues requiring medication that the family could barely afford. Tariq had hunted this type of prey before. The pattern was familiar. Identify vulnerability, offer rescue, create dependency, then extract whatever he wanted as payment for his generosity. It had worked a dozen times before. It would work again. The approach came 6 weeks after their initial meeting. Carlos received instructions to bring his wife to a meeting at the Khalid Enterprises office on a Saturday morning. The summons was unusual enough to make Carlos nervous, but refusing a direct request from his employer was unthinkable. They arrived at 10:00 a.m. to find the offices mostly empty, just weekend security personnel and a skeleton crew. Mrs. Sharma met them in the lobby, her expression professionally friendly. "Mr. Al-Nahyan would like to speak with you both," she said. "He has a proposal regarding Isabella's employment situation." The meeting took place in Tariq's executive office, a space that occupied an entire corner of the 40th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided panoramic views of Dubai's skyline. The furniture was museum quality, a mix of modern design and traditional Gulf art that spoke of wealth so profound it didn't need to announce itself. Tariq sat behind a desk made from a single piece of polished burled wood that probably cost more than Carlos would earn in a lifetime. He gestured for them to sit in the chairs facing him, creating a power dynamic that was impossible to ignore. "Carlos, you've been an excellent driver," Tariq began. "Punctual, discreet, reliable, these qualities are rare and valuable." "Thank you, sir," Carlos replied, confusion evident in his voice. "I understand your wife is currently employed by the Al-Mazrui family in conditions that are, shall we say, less than ideal." Tariq's attention shifted to Isabella. 18-hour days, minimal salary, debt accumulating faster than you can pay it off. This is not uncommon, but it is unfortunate. Isabella felt exposed, violated by how much this powerful stranger knew about her private struggles. "I would like to offer a solution," Tariq continued. "I need someone to manage my personal residence, the penthouse in Celestial Heights. The position would include accommodation, a private room within the apartment, a salary of 8,000 dirhams monthly, and immediate payment of 100,000 pesos toward your debt in Manila." The numbers hit Isabella like physical blows. 8,000 dirhams was nearly 7 times her current salary. 100,000 pesos would cut her debt by more than half, stopping the hemorrhaging interest that had been slowly destroying her financial future. "Additionally," Tariq said, his tone casual, "there would be opportunities for performance bonuses. I entertain frequently and require someone who can manage household operations with professionalism and discretion. Excel in this role, and you could pay off your entire debt within 6 months." Carlos's initial reaction was relief mixed with gratitude. This seemed like a miracle, an answer to prayers they had been offering desperately. But some instinct, perhaps the knowledge gained from 2 years of driving his employer to clandestine meetings, made him hesitate. "Sir, this is incredibly generous," Carlos said carefully. "But Isabella and I have just married. Living separately would be difficult." "Understandable," Tariq acknowledged. "However, the accommodation I'm offering is far superior to what you currently share. Isabella would have her own room with private bathroom in a luxury penthouse with every amenity. You would be welcome to visit on your days off, and consider the financial benefits. 6 months of this arrangement and both of you would be debt-free, able to save aggressively toward your future." The logic was compelling, the offer almost too good to refuse. But Carlos knew enough about his employer to recognize that such generosity never came without strings attached. "May we discuss this privately?" Carlos asked. "Of course," Tariq said smoothly. "Take the weekend to consider, but I will need an answer by Monday. I have other candidates if this doesn't suit your circumstances." The threat was subtle but clear. This opportunity would not wait, accept or lose it forever. That weekend, Carlos and Isabella barely slept. They discussed the offer from every angle, weighing the financial benefits against the risks they couldn't fully articulate. Isabella was desperate. The loan shark had begun sending threatening messages to her mother. Her youngest sister needed school supplies. Her mother needed a medical procedure that would cost 40,000 pesos. "It's just 6 months," Isabella argued. "We can endure anything for 6 months if it means freedom from this debt." Carlos wanted to protect his wife, but he also couldn't ignore the brutal mathematics of their situation. At their current earning rate, paying off Isabella's debt would take years, possibly decades if the interest continued compounding. This offer could change everything. On Monday morning, Isabella accepted the position. The penthouse in Celestial Heights occupied the entire 58th floor, 12,000 square feet of space that redefined luxury. Entering it for the first time, Isabella felt like an astronaut landing on another planet. Everything was white. White marble, white leather furniture, white curtains that filtered Arabian sunlight into soft, diffused glow. The kitchen was equipped with professional-grade appliances that Isabella barely knew how to operate. The bathrooms featured fixtures made of gold, not gold-plated, but solid gold faucets and towel racks. The master bedroom had a bed custom-made in Italy, with a mattress that cost 150,000 dirhams alone. Her quarters, as Tariq had promised, were private and luxurious by any standard. A room 3 times the size of the space she had been sharing with 2 other workers, with an ensuite bathroom, a small sitting area, and windows overlooking Dubai Marina's yacht-filled waters. For the first 3 weeks, the arrangement seemed legitimate. Tariq traveled extensively for business, spending perhaps 4 nights weekly in the penthouse. When present, he was professional and distant. Isabella's duties were straightforward: maintain the apartment, manage the cleaning service that came twice weekly, prepare breakfast on mornings when Tariq was in residence, and coordinate with his personal assistant regarding his schedule. The work was easier than anything she had experienced in Dubai. No more 18-hour days. No more verbal abuse from employers who viewed her as property rather than human. She had time to video call her family, to read books from Tariq's extensive library, to simply rest in ways she hadn't been able to for over a year. The promised 100,000 pesos was transferred to her mother within 1 week of Isabella starting the position. Luz's tearful gratitude over video call made every compromise seem worthwhile. Carlos visited on his days off, uncomfortable with the luxury but relieved to see his wife looking healthier, less stressed. They would spend afternoons on the penthouse's terrace, talking about their plans for the future, dreaming about returning to the Philippines someday with enough savings to start a small business. But Tariq was patient. He understood that seduction required groundwork, trust-building, the gradual erosion of boundaries. He began small, a compliment about how well Isabella maintained the apartment, a gift of designer clothes presented as necessary uniforms for someone working in such an exclusive environment, invitations to join him for dinner when he entertained, ostensibly to help manage the service but gradually positioning her as hostess rather than staff. The shift was so gradual that Isabella barely noticed it happening. Tariq would ask her opinion on wine selections, on menu choices, on decorating decisions. He would inquire about her family, expressing genuine-seeming concern about her mother's health, offering to arrange medical care through his contacts in Manila. "You're too intelligent to be just a housekeeper," he told her one evening after a dinner party where she had impressed his guests with her poise. "You have a natural grace. With the right opportunities, you could accomplish remarkable things." The words were honey, sweet, and seductive, filling spaces in Isabella's self-image that poverty and hardship had hollowed out. She had spent her entire life being told she was worthless except for her labor. Tariq's attention made her feel seen in ways she had never experienced. The first physical contact came 2 months into her employment. Isabella was reaching for a high shelf in the kitchen, trying to retrieve a serving platter. Tariq appeared behind her, his hand covering hers, his body pressing close under the pretense of helping. "Let me," he said, his voice low, his breath against her ear. Isabella froze, her body's alarm system screaming warnings that her mind tried to rationalize away. He was just being helpful. She was imagining the intimacy of the moment. It meant nothing. But it meant everything. Over the following weeks, Tariq's touches became more frequent, more deliberate. A hand on her shoulder when giving instructions, fingers brushing hers when accepting a coffee cup, sitting too close during their dinner conversations, his knee pressing against hers under the table. Each violation of professional boundaries came with plausible deniability. Each could be dismissed as accidental, innocent. But accumulated together, they created a pattern that Isabella couldn't ignore even as she tried desperately to maintain the fiction of a normal employer-employee relationship. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in June. Tariq had been drinking, not excessively but enough to lower the inhibitions that had kept his pursuit subtle. Isabella was preparing to leave for the weekend, to meet Carlos who was waiting downstairs, when Tariq stopped her. "Stay," he said simply. "Have a drink with me." "Sir, my husband is waiting," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Carlos can wait 15 minutes, Tariq said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. They sat on the terrace, the city lights spreading below them like scattered diamonds. Tariq poured expensive whiskey into crystal glasses, handing one to Isabella despite her protests that she didn't drink. "To your success," he said, raising his glass. "You've exceeded every expectation." They talked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Tariq spoke about his loneliness, about his arranged marriage that was loveless and purely functional, about the isolation that came with his position and wealth. "Everyone wants something from me," he said, his vulnerability seeming genuine. "My wife wants status, my children want money, my employees want security, but you—" He paused, his gaze intense. "You're different. You ask for nothing except the opportunity to work honestly." The manipulation was textbook perfect, creating intimacy through shared confidences, positioning himself as vulnerable rather than powerful, making Isabella feel special rather than targeted. When he leaned in to kiss her, Isabella's shocked rejection came too late. His mouth was on hers, his hands pulling her close, before she could process what was happening and push him away. "I'm married," she said, her voice shaking. "Sir, please, this is wrong." Tariq's expression transformed, all pretense of vulnerability vanishing. "Wrong," he repeated, his voice cold. "I've paid 100,000 pesos of your debt. I've given you a salary beyond anything you could earn elsewhere. I've treated you like a human being instead of a servant, and you think I did this out of generosity." The truth, laid bare, was horrifying. Every kindness had been calculated. Every compliment had been manipulation. The entire arrangement had been a trap, and Isabella had walked into it voluntarily, bringing her husband's trust and her own dignity as offerings. "I will not be your mistress," Isabella said, standing, her dignity intact even as her world crumbled. "I'll return every peso, I'll find other employment, but I will not betray my husband." Tariq's laugh was ugly. "Return the money with what? You earn 8,000 dirhams monthly. The debt you still owe the loan shark is over 100,000 pesos plus accumulated interest. Your mother needs medical care that costs another 50,000 pesos. Your sisters need school fees. You can't afford principals, Isabella. You can barely afford to survive." The brutal honesty of her situation paralyzed her. He was right. She had no savings, no resources, no options. Walking away would mean defaulting on the loan shark debt, which would put her entire family at risk. Returning to the Al-Mazrui household, even if they would take her back, would mean returning to exploitation that was barely better than slavery. "Let me make this simple," Tariq continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to negotiations. "You can continue your employment here under new terms. Be available to me when I require companionship. In exchange, I'll pay off your entire debt within 3 months, increase your salary to 15,000 dirhams monthly, and ensure your family in Manila receives regular financial support. Or you can refuse, forfeit your current salary, and try to survive on your own with a loan shark sending threats to your mother's door." "What about Carlos?" Isabella whispered. "What about him?" Tariq replied dismissively. "He remains my driver. He knows nothing unless you tell him. His employment is secure as long as you're reasonable. Refuse me, and I'll find a reason to terminate him. Then both of you will be unemployed with mounting debts and no visa sponsorship." The threat to Carlos broke something in Isabella. She could accept consequences for her own choices, but she couldn't destroy her husband's livelihood, couldn't send him back to the Philippines in shame and failure. "How long?" she asked, defeated. "As long as it pleases me," Tariq answered. "But I'm easily bored, 6 months, perhaps a year. Then you'll have enough money to start whatever life you want, and I'll move on to other interests." Isabella's capitulation came not from desire or even from fear for herself, but from the impossible weight of responsibility she carried for her family, her husband, her siblings, her mother. The choice was to betray Carlos or destroy everyone she loved. She chose betrayal. The affair began that night, consummated in Tariq's luxurious master bedroom, while Carlos waited downstairs for a wife who would arrive 3 hours late with a practiced lie about unexpected work demands. The physical act was mechanical, transactional, devoid of pleasure for Isabella, who endured it as she had endured every other hardship in her life, by disconnecting her mind from her body and focusing on the survival this sacrifice would purchase. Tariq, satisfied with his conquest, became almost kind in the aftermath. He transferred another 50,000 pesos to Isabella's mother the next day. He gave Isabella a gold bracelet worth 20,000 dirhams, a marker of his possession. He arranged for her salary increase to begin immediately. The arrangement settled into a routine that Isabella navigated with growing skill. During the week, when Tariq was present, she was his mistress, available for sex and companionship whenever he desired. On weekends, when Carlos visited, she transformed back into the faithful wife, performing normalcy with the same dedication she brought to every role circumstances forced upon her. The lies accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, gradually burying the woman she had been under the woman she was becoming. She lied to Carlos about the bruises Tariq's rough handling left on her body, blaming clumsy accidents. She lied about her increased salary, claiming Tariq had given her a promotion to estate manager to justify the extra money. She lied about her emotional distance, attributing it to stress and fatigue. Carlos, focused on his own work and trusting his wife completely, accepted these explanations. His relief at their improved financial situation made him incurious about details. Within 2 months, Isabella's debt to the loan shark was completely paid. Her mother received medical treatment that improved her quality of life dramatically. Her sisters had new school uniforms and supplies. Every material improvement in her family's circumstances was built on the foundation of Isabella's betrayal, and she couldn't escape the arithmetic that made her sacrifice seem justified even as it destroyed her soul piece by piece. But Isabella was not Tariq's only secret. The man who had so carefully engineered her seduction and submission was simultaneously conducting another affair that would prove even more dangerous. Dr. Amara Hassan was everything Isabella was not: educated, sophisticated, confident, and completely aware of what she was doing. At 34, she was a consultant psychiatrist at Dubai's most exclusive private hospital, treating wealthy patients whose mental health issues were complicated by unlimited resources and zero consequences. She had met Tariq at a charity gala in April 2018, 2 months before he successfully seduced Isabella. Their affair had begun that night, fueled by mutual attraction and shared cynicism about the world they inhabited. Amara had no illusions about Tariq's character or his other relationships. She didn't want marriage or commitment. She wanted excitement and the material benefits that came from being connected to wealth. Unlike Isabella, Amara negotiated her position from strength. She was financially independent, visa secure, and emotionally detached. She accepted expensive gifts without feeling obligated. She enjoyed sex without confusing it with love. To her, the affair was a transaction between equals, both extracting value from an arrangement that satisfied their needs. Tariq found this refreshing. With Isabella, he had the satisfaction of control and conquest, but with Amara, he had intellectual stimulation and genuine desire. She challenged him in ways that Isabella, constrained by fear and economic desperation, never could. What neither woman knew was that Tariq was conducting both affairs simultaneously, often seeing Amara in the afternoon before returning to the penthouse where Isabella waited. The secrecy thrilled him, the juggling of relationships and the risk of discovery adding spice to what might otherwise have become routine. The collision course was inevitable. Tariq's arrogance made him careless. In September 2018, he began inviting Amara to the Celestial Heights penthouse when Isabella was supposed to be absent, enjoying the perverse pleasure of having two mistresses associated with the same location. Isabella discovered Amara's existence by accident. Returning early from an errand, she entered the penthouse to hear unmistakable sounds coming from the master bedroom. The woman's voice was different from her own, confident and demanding rather than resigned and quiet. She should have left immediately, should have pretended she hadn't heard or seen anything. But some self-destructive impulse made her wait in the kitchen until Amara emerged, dressed in designer clothes that screamed wealth and confidence, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. The two women locked eyes, and in that moment both understood exactly what they were to Tariq: possessions, interchangeable parts in his collection of beautiful objects. The revelation was devastating for Isabella, who had at least maintained the fiction that her suffering was unique, that Tariq's attention meant something beyond pure exploitation. For Amara, the discovery of Isabella was more complicated. She had known Tariq had other affairs, but confronting the reality of one, particularly with a woman who was clearly being coerced rather than compensated fairly, triggered an unexpected guilt response. "How long?" Amara asked simply. "4 months," Isabella replied, her voice hollow. They didn't speak again that day, but the knowledge of each other's existence created a fault line in Tariq's carefully constructed world. Both women began to see their situations more clearly, stripped of the rationalizations that had made participation bearable. The third person who would complete this tragedy's death toll was, ironically, the one who least deserved his fate. Carlos Mendoza remained blissfully unaware of his wife's infidelity, trusting her completely even as mounting evidence suggested something was wrong. Isabella's increasing emotional distance, her reluctance to be intimate with him, her distracted responses during their conversations, all pointed to problems Carlos attributed to work stress rather than betrayal. His turning point came on November 10, 2018, when he overheard a phone conversation between two other drivers discussing Tariq's affairs. The word penthouse and new one caught his attention. One driver mentioned seeing his employer enter the building with a beautiful Filipina woman who clearly wasn't staff based on how he touched her. Carlos's world tilted on its axis. The description could have been anyone, but instinct told him otherwise. He began paying closer attention, noting the occasions when Tariq requested to be dropped at Celestial Heights but didn't want Carlos to wait, suggesting he had someone inside who would accommodate his needs. The surveillance that followed was unsophisticated but effective. On November 11th, Carlos's day off, he positioned himself in a coffee shop across from Celestial Heights and waited. At 2:30 p.m., he saw Tariq enter the building. At 6:45 p.m., he saw Isabella exit, her expression haunted, her posture defeated. The betrayal hit him like a physical assault. His wife, the woman he had married in good faith, the partner he worked brutal hours to support, was sleeping with his employer. Every financial improvement in their situation suddenly made horrible sense. The paid-off debt, the increased salary, the gifts to her family, all were compensation for her body, her dignity, her marriage vows. Carlos spent that night in a haze of rage and grief. He wanted to confront Isabella immediately, to demand explanation and accountability. But another part of him wanted to confront Tariq, to reclaim some fragment of masculine pride by challenging the man who had destroyed his marriage. By November 12th, Carlos had decided on confrontation rather than retreat. He would go to the penthouse, face both his wife and his employer, and force acknowledgement of what had been done to him. He had no plan beyond this, no clear vision of what justice might look like, but inaction had become impossible. At 4:15 a.m. on November 12th, Carlos used his knowledge of Celestial Heights security, gained from months of driving Tariq, to access the 58th floor. The penthouse door, which he knew the code to from occasions when he'd helped move luggage, opened easily. What he found inside would haunt the investigation for months. Tariq was in the living room, very much alive, in the midst of an argument with Dr. Amara Hassan. The content of their dispute was unclear, but Amara's raised voice and Tariq's aggressive posture suggested a relationship collapsing under its own contradictions. Isabella was in her quarters, awakened by the shouting, emerging in her nightgown to see what was happening. And Carlos appeared from the entryway, his presence shocking all three people who had been so consumed by their own drama that they failed to notice his arrival. "Carlos," Isabella gasped, her face draining of color. "You're in my home," Tariq said, his tone authoritative despite being caught mid-argument with a mistress while another mistress watched. "Your home," Carlos repeated, his voice eerily calm. "Your employee, your driver, your wife's employer. Is there anything in this city you don't own?" Amara, reading the dangerous emotional currents, moved toward the door. "I should leave." "Stay," Carlos commanded, his authority surprising everyone, including himself. "You're part of this. All of you are part of what's been done to me." What happened next unfolded with the terrible momentum of Greek tragedy, each person's actions flowing from character and circumstances, unavoidable and yet entirely avoidable if any single choice had been different. Tariq, accustomed to control and unused to being challenged by people he considered beneath him, made the fatal mistake of responding with contempt rather than caution. "You should leave, Carlos," he said dismissively. "This is a private matter that doesn't concern you." "My wife is your whore, and it doesn't concern me." Carlos's voice cracked, years of suppressed rage and humiliation finally breaking through his carefully maintained professionalism. Isabella moved toward her husband, her hands outstretched in supplication. "Carlos, please, let me explain. I did it for us, for our families. I had no choice." "There's always a choice," Carlos said, his eyes not leaving Tariq. "You chose money over marriage. You chose him over me. You chose to destroy everything we built." "What exactly did you build?" Tariq interjected, his arrogance suicidal in its timing. "A life of poverty and struggle. I gave her more in 4 months than you could give her in 4 years. Your pride is wounded, but her material circumstances are improved. That's the rational calculation." The knife came from the kitchen, a 10-inch chef's knife from the German set that Isabella used to prepare Tariq's meals. Carlos didn't remember picking it up, didn't remember crossing the distance between himself and his employer. But suddenly he was standing over Tariq's fallen body, the knife buried in the other man's chest, blood spreading across the white marble floor like spilled wine. Amara screamed, Isabella collapsed, and Carlos stared at his hands, red with blood, as the magnitude of what he'd done crashed over him. But the tragedy wasn't finished. Tariq, critically wounded but not yet dead, managed to pull himself toward the phone, trying to call for help. Carlos, operating now on pure instinct and panic, struck again, this time with a heavy crystal decanter that had held Tariq's whiskey. The sound of glass meeting skull was sickening, final. Amara ran for the door, but Carlos intercepted her, his mind no longer processing rational thought. She had been part of his humiliation, a witness to his shame, another person who had known about his wife's betrayal while he remained ignorant. Her death was quick, a single stab wound to the throat as she tried to push past him. And then there was only Isabella, paralyzed with shock, staring at the carnage that had erupted from secrets and lies and impossible choices made under crushing pressure. "We could have survived poverty," Carlos said, his voice breaking. "We could have survived anything together, but you took that choice from me. You decided my dignity was worth less than money." Isabella couldn't speak, couldn't form words that would bridge the impossible distance between them. She had sacrificed everything for family, for survival, for the crushing weight of responsibility that made personal happiness seem selfish. And in doing so, She had destroyed the only person who had ever truly loved her. The knife, still in Carlos's hand, turned toward Isabella. But before he could complete the murder-suicide that seemed the only possible ending to this horror, his body rebelled. The adrenaline that had fueled his violence drained away, leaving him empty, collapsing to his knees in the blood of the people he had killed. Isabella, operating on instinct, called the police. The emergency dispatcher asked her to remain calm, to stay on the line, to not touch anything. She did none of these things. Instead, she sat beside her husband, her hands in his blood-stained ones, waiting for consequences that seemed both inevitable and insufficient for the magnitude of what had been lost. When Dubai police arrived at 4:47 a.m., they found a scene of almost operatic tragedy. 3 bodies, Tariq Al-Nahyan, dead from multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma. Dr. Amara Hassan, dead from a severed carotid artery. Carlos Mendoza, who had used the chef's knife to slash his own wrists in a final act of desperation, bleeding out on the marble floor while his wife held him. Isabella survived. She was arrested, interrogated for days, charged as an accessory despite overwhelming evidence that she had been a victim long before she became a witness to murder. The legal proceedings were complicated by the prominence of the deceased and the sensational nature of the crime. The Khalid family's lawyers pushed for maximum prosecution, arguing that Isabella's affair with Tariq had precipitated the violence. The Philippine consulate intervened, highlighting the coercive circumstances of Isabella's employment and the power imbalances that had made her vulnerable to exploitation. The trial became a referendum on Dubai's treatment of migrant workers, on the systems that made people like Isabella so desperate that they would accept any arrangement for survival, on the impunity enjoyed by wealthy men whose appetites destroyed lives without consequence. Isabella was ultimately convicted of accessory after the fact for failing to intervene to prevent Carlos's suicide, but sentenced to time served given her status as a trafficking victim. She was deported to the Philippines in March 2019, returning to a family who struggled to reconcile the daughter they knew with the woman who had survived such horror. Carlos's body was returned to his family in Mindanao. His mother, devastated by the loss and the scandal, refused to discuss the circumstances of his death. His sisters, now educated because of his sacrifices, carried the complicated legacy of opportunities purchased with a brother's destroyed life. Tariq's death was mourned publicly and briefly. His family's wealth ensured a quick burial and even quicker suppression of details that might tarnish their reputation. Within 6 months, he had been effectively erased from public consciousness, remembered only by those whose lives he had destroyed. Dr. Amara Hassan's death received the least attention, a footnote in a story dominated by wealth and migrant worker exploitation. Her family in Egypt mourned privately, struggling to understand how their successful daughter had become collateral damage in other people's catastrophic choices. The penthouse in Celestial Heights remained empty for 2 years before being sold at a significant discount. The new owners renovated extensively, trying to erase the energy of violence that seemed to linger in the space, despite fresh paint and new furnishings. Isabella Santos lives now in Manila in a small apartment paid for by a victim's compensation fund. She works in a call center, speaks to no one about Dubai, and visits her mother weekly. The money that had been the catalyst for so much tragedy turned out to be cursed, most of it confiscated during the legal proceedings, the remainder spent on lawyer fees and restitution. She carries the weight of 3 deaths, understanding that while she was a victim of exploitation, she was also a participant in betrayal. The moral complexity of her choices, made under crushing duress but still freely chosen at crucial moments, defines her existence now. She attends church regularly, seeking forgiveness for sins that feel too large for redemption but too human to be purely evil. The story of the Celestial Heights murders serves as a cautionary tale in Dubai's Filipino community, whispered at church gatherings and community center meetings. It's a reminder of the razor's edge that migrant workers walk, where desperation can make exploitation seem like opportunity, where survival can require sacrifices that destroy the very things worth surviving for. The questions raised by this tragedy resist easy answers. Was Isabella a victim or a perpetrator? Was Carlos's violence justified rage or inexcusable murder? Was Tariq's death punishment for exploitation or simply the consequence of underestimating a desperate man's capacity for violence? What remains clear is that systems of profound inequality create conditions where tragedy becomes inevitable. When human beings are reduced to economic calculations, when survival requires the sacrifice of dignity, when power operates without accountability, the potential for catastrophic violence simmers beneath surfaces that appear ordered and peaceful. Dubai continues to glitter, its towers rising higher each year, built on the labor of millions like Isabella and Carlos who arrive with dreams and leave with trauma. The city's immaculate facade reveals nothing of the exploitation beneath. But for those who know where to look, the cracks are visible, running deep through foundations built on sand and watered with tears. The golden chain that Isabella once wore, a symbol of Tariq's possession, was never found after the murders. Perhaps it fell into a corner during the violence, forgotten in the chaos. Or perhaps Isabella took it with her, a reminder of the price of survival and the cost of compromises made under impossible pressure. If you've made it this far, thank you for bearing witness to a story that resists simplification. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that true crime should illuminate systemic failures rather than simply sensationalize tragedy. Share this with someone who needs to understand the real costs of migrant labor and exploitation. And remember, behind every statistic about overseas workers are human beings making impossible choices in systems designed to crush them. When does survival require too much? When does desperation justify betrayal? And who is responsible when people placed in impossible situations make terrible choices? These are questions without comfortable answers, but they demand our attention if we're serious about preventing future tragedies. Don't let these deaths be forgotten. Don't let the systems that enabled this violence continue unchallenged. Your engagement with stories like this is the first step toward demanding the accountability that might save the next Isabella, the next Carlos, the next person caught between dignity and survival. The penthouse remains empty tonight, its windows dark, overlooking a city that never stops moving forward, leaving its casualties behind.